I'm Joyce Hornady. You might say accuracy is my business. I make bullets.
You are listening to the Hornady Podcast.
Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Hornady Podcast. I'm your host, Seth, and today I've got the guests you want to hear from. I've got Senior Ballistician Jayden Quinlan and Project Engineer Neville. Guys, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely.
You bet.
Awesome, guys. Well, we've got a good topic for the listener, for the technical crowd, for the precision rifle guy, for the long-range shooter. We've got a good topic for today. But before we get there, we got to talk about these beer steins.
Yeah.
So the beer steins, one of our good friends in the industry, good friend of Hornady, good friend of all of ours, Lisa Hoffman from OMI in Germany, had these beer steins custom made in Germany for you and me.
That's pretty cool.
So that's pretty cool. So listeners, check this out on the YouTube. We've got these awesome beer steins. They've got a custom Hornady Podcast logo with Quinlan's Corner, and then they've got our name on the back. So shout out to Lisa and the folks over at OMI. Thank you. This was a super cool gesture. Now, she did say that because they're beer steins and because they're German, that if we put water in them, they will crack.
There's no water in mine.
No. So no, we've got some hot black coffee, though, which goes a long way.
It's, yeah. On a Thursday afternoon, it's helpful.
It is helpful. And they look cool. And again, that was a super awesome gesture. And we do have some Hornady swag in the works. I know we've mentioned it in previous podcasts, but this, again, I've said this 100 times, but this podcast is very much a corollary to our job. This is not the job. This is just something that we get together and squeeze in when we can. So the Hornady swag for the podcast has been kind of a slow roll project. We've got an in-house graphic designer who does an awesome job with everything he does. It's just he's got a lot of other things to do as well. But it is coming. If you'd like to see a coffee cup, let us know in the comments. Big coffee guy. I want to have a coffee cup, so be helpful to have.
Well, thanks to Lisa, I got one with my name on it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So getting into today's topic, I wanted to get deeper into temperature sensitivity of gunpowder. Now, we did a whole podcast on propellant and powder, and it was a great podcast. It was more broad level in terms of temperature sensitivity, but as a long-range shooter, as a precision rifle competitor, temperature sensitivity is something that we all need to be knowledgeable of and at varying degrees concerned with. You know, there are instances you can get away with a lot of things and not have any concern, not even know it exists. But there are also times where if you don't account for it, you start stretching the legs on what you're shooting, you're going to miss the target simply because of the temperature sensitivity of the propellant. And I want to look at this from a couple different ways. The first, I think it would benefit the listener if we went into what it is, how to control it, what the manufacturer does, the manufacturers of the powder, what do they do to make it better or worse? Is it cartridge dependent? Is it cartridge case dependent? So dive into more of the nuts and bolts of stability, and then look at some test examples, which I know you've prepared. And then I'd like to transition to, okay, we know what it is now. We know the science of it. Well, what do we do with it? How do we control it to help us hit the target? So with that in mind, what is temperature sensitivity? Obviously, the name is pretty self-explanatory, but there's a belief that it's always, as it gets hotter, powder creates more pressure. Is that always the case?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Nope.
I guess temperature sensitivity as a definition would be your propellant is sensitive to the temperature that it's starting to burn at.
Okay.
So it burns differently depending on what the temperature is. It would be another way to think of it.
Yeah, the outside temperature. So
Yes.
if it's freezing outside on a deer hunt.
Well, not so much outside unless your ammunition is the same temperature as outside, but it would be the temperature of the propellant itself. Generally, yeah, that's going to be associated with whatever temperature you're in or acclimated to.
Okay, but if you've got your ammo in your pocket or sitting in a magazine, baking in the sun on top of your pack or something like that,
right.
It's going to be different.
That's right.
That's an important note.
Yep. But I mean, typically what the average user will see is a change in muzzle velocity, but that isn't the only thing that's changing. the reason that you're getting a change in muzzle velocity is because that propellant is burning differently.
Mhm.
Because you have the same charge weight, right? You have the same energy potential within the cartridge case, same charge weight, same type of propellant. So when you get a different result, that means that, and the firearm is the same, right? Chamber dimensions are the same, bore and groove, barrel length, all that stuff is the same bullet. All that stuff is the same, but you see a change when there's a change in temperature. That's because the propellant is not burning the same way at that temperature as it is a different temperature. You see it as a muzzle velocity change, but it changes muzzle velocity, it changes chamber pressure, it can change flash, how much of a fireball you emit. It can change cleanliness. Essentially, anything that's tied back to velocity and pressure, which all of those are, you can experience changes in.
Yeah, and if you play with your muzzle velocity, you're going to play with your point of impact.
You can even change the shape, like the pressure versus time curve.
Yeah, for running a pressure-based system, so semi-automatic gas impingement, piston gun, even fully automatic machine gun systems, that's a consideration. Absolutely, it can change the rate at which the gun runs. It can change the pressures that are available. Absolutely.
Yeah. Some of that even plays into dispersion. You can have that change basically in the whatever's going on in the pressure versus time realm change and muzzle velocity or whatever, or even erratic behavior can show up if you get too far off one end or the other. If you can have a load that shoots really well at 60 degrees, go shoot it at 110 and have it completely fall apart on you.
That's a problem. And, you mentioned fully automatic machine guns. Obviously, there's a military application where, that's not a precision instrument by any means, but if it's going to affect the functionality or your maximum range, that's something you need to know about, especially to have a firearm become inoperable or not, if you fails to extract or something like that. That's a problem. If you're out on a coyote hunt or prairie dog shoot, not quite as mission critical, but still an inconvenience. And I feel like most powder manufacturers in the modern era, even the bad ones, aren't that bad for the most part. Was that a safe statement?
Yeah, I think so.
There's a few that are still out there.
Yeah, you can get some wild ones.
But it's much better now than it was 50 years ago.
Sure.
I think that's a fair statement.
So what about propellant? I know you guys aren't powder manufacturers. What about the propellant makes it sensitive, more or less sensitive?
It seems to be the chemistry of the propellant is one of the main drivers.
Okay.
So I think we had talked in the propellant podcast that you have three kind of main categories. You have the geometry of the powder, what it's shaped like and what its size is, the chemistry of the powder, what makes it up, and then the pressure that it's burning at.
Right.
And those three things kind of combine to give you the result that you get. The chemistry piece is where we see the differences most closely correlated. So we have a lot of powders that we use that aren't commercially available. And then we have access to obviously all the commercially available powders as well. And typically when you see a powder that's very temperature stable, meaning the change in pressure and velocity or accuracy or whatever, metric you want to look at, when that changes is a lot compared to another powder that barely changes at all, typically what we see is the powders that have high temperature sensitivity have high energy content.
Okay.
And typically that energy content in small cal rifle powders or even pistol powders or shot shell powders comes in the form of nitroglycerin. So I know we had talked about nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin, and then once you get into other stuff, you get into some triple based options. So you have single base and double base is primarily what's used in everything that we do and customers and listeners will do. But generally that's where you'll see powders become the most sensitive is with high energy content with added nitroglycerin.
So the main energy source for a single base propellant being nitrocellulose,
right,
doesn't seem to have as much sensitivity as when you add nitroglycerin. The nitroglycerin content is what drives the lion's share of its sensitivity. So some examples of that would be all of your spherical powders, Winchester 748, BLC2, CFE 223, Lever Evolution, and all your pistol powders as well. power pistol.
I wouldn't say all of them.
No, but the hefty
so like
majority.
the Stay-Ball Match, Stable HD, that's kind of a newer family, and those are actually extremely temperature stable.
But they do contain nitroglycerin.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what I was referencing, not necessarily the stability, but the inclusion of nitroglycerin you're going to find in spherical powders and in some extruded propellants as well. And it says right on the container, double based. I know a lot of the accurate propellants, like Accurate 4064, for example, it says right on there that it's a double based extruded propellant.
Right.
So the double base meaning two energy sources, one of which the nitroglycerin driving some of that sensitivity. We'll get into the new Stay-Ball HD stuff from Winchester here probably a little bit later as we talk about the geometry, because that's another driver of how the powder manufacturer controls some of that temperature stability.
Yeah, some of it. I think we had described in that other podcast the chemical deterrents that are added to slow down the burn rate. And you can certainly see effects with temperature sensitivity in that, depending on where that deterrent layer is within the granule powder and how deep it is and what the gradient of its penetration looks like. You can see pretty big differences in the sensitivity of it.
Awesome. Yeah.
So these are all things, obviously, that the label of powder tells you, so you'll be able to easily sort it out yourself. That's a bad joke.
Right. So you've got the addition of nitroglycerin driving a lot of sensitivity. Then you have some baked on deterrents, so some more chemicals, if you will. And then the geometry, how they roll that or pre-fracture some of the grain structure. They can control it that way. So getting back to the Stay-Ball HD line, that seems to be an outlier. Typically, if you've got a double base spherical propellant, it's going to be pretty sensitive to the temperature. The exclusions are Stay-Ball Match, Stay-Ball HD.
Right.
And I'm guessing they control a lot of that, despite the nitroglycerin, with maybe a geometry change or
I think that one's chemistry.
Use of deterrents.
Yeah, that one's a chemistry thing, and it's unicorn dust.
And just because you have nitroglycerin in the powder doesn't mean your temperature sensitivity will be bad. Typically, the higher nitro level powders are worse, so you can kind of trend that generally. But you can take a double base powder and cut back on the nitroglycerin level a little bit. That's going to hedge your bets to better temperature stability, but you still have some added energy content to get the velocity that you're looking for.
Okay.
And then, although it has the nitroglycerin, you can compensate, like you're saying, Miles, with other chemical stuff, whether that's deterrents or whatever it may be.
Okay. That's good to know. Now, so we control it with chemistry, we control it with deterrents, we control it with a little bit of geometry. As a reloader, we do our best to choose the powders that are going to work for us and that are available. So in a given propellant, let's say you've got a cartridge like a 300 Win Mag, and that same propellant also works in a 6.5 Creedmoor.
Sure.
Or 270 or something like that. Does the cartridge volume play into the sensitivity of a particular propellant?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
Okay. That's an important note, because I feel like there are a lot of powders out there that people go, oh, I'm using, fill in the blank, let's say Varget. So temperature stability is like 0.2 or 0.3 feet per second per degree. I don't need to worry about it. But they're going off of anecdotal data, and based on their individual cartridge volume, it could actually be maybe better or worse than what they thought.
Out here, you may only get one chance. So never compromise. At any distance. Match accurate ELDX bullets, highest BCs, flat trajectories, and unparalleled terminal performance at all practical ranges. Precision Hunter ammunition from Hornady.
That's right. Yeah, so I brought some data up specifically to address that. So this is a pretty common rifle speed powder.
Yep.
It is a double base powder, so it's got some good energy content to it.
Yeah, well, we can call this one out for what it is. This is Alliant Reloader 17.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have had phenomenal accuracy results from Reloader 17.
Yeah.
In everything I've ever shot it in. even my old 257 Roberts doesn't shoot anything well. It shot that better than almost anything. I've used it in a Creedmoor. I mean, I've used it in a 7 PRC. I've used it in a 6.5 PRC. I've used it in everything I've ever shot it in has just worked.
Yeah, it shoots really good for
my
dispersion.
7 mag years ago.
Yeah. So up top, we have a 300 Win Mag with a 180 grain bullet. And in the ballistics lab, we have an oven and multiple ovens and multiple freezers that we can throw the ammo into. They're a controlled environment. We typically let stuff sit for a couple hours, sometimes overnight, sometimes over a weekend. Sometimes I'll leave it in for a month. We do a bunch of different types of testing. Mm-hmm. But that's right outside of where we test. So the room that those are housed in is just outside the door of the test bays where we conduct pressure and velocity testing. And so that allows us to take the round of ammunition from its conditioned state, say in a freezer, and immediately put it in the barrel and fire it within a matter of seconds. Mm-hmm. And so that's where this data comes from.
Okay.
We do a ton of temperature testing. Every load we develop pretty much gets temperature tested to make sure that everything's good. It's going to work. It's going to be safe. So this 300 Win Mag with a 180 grain. 70 degrees is our ambient test. And then this test data set was from a 0 degree test and a 125 degree test.
Okay. So that's a huge spread.
That's a pretty good spread. Yeah. That encompasses probably the lion's share of shooters out there. Yeah. Although we go outside of those envelopes because it can happen. Certainly.
Absolutely. Well, I've shot animals below 0.
Yeah.
Like in a hunting situation.
Yeah. And we've shot matches where our ammo's above 125.
Yeah. Especially you forget that magazine sitting on top of your pack for 15 minutes while you're jaw jacking or watching targets, and next thing you know, I'm up next, and you
barely
go grab your mag. Yeah.
So in this Win Mag test, from 70 degrees down to 0, it dropped 67 feet per second.
Okay.
And it dropped 3,000 pounds of pressure. From 70 degrees up to 125, it gained 33 feet a second and gained 1,400 pounds of pressure. So you can see there, it's not necessarily symmetrical. Granted, the temperature isn't symmetrical, right? You're going from 70 to 0, so you're dropping 70 degrees there, and then 70 up to 125, so you're 55 degrees?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
But that wouldn't be super concerning. If you're shooting targets, beyond about a half a second time of flight, you're going to start to see that if you're operating at the extremes and you don't account for it. Mm-hmm. But let's go to the next cartridge. So in
summary, real quick, that was from 70 down to 0, it shifted 0.96 feet per second per degree. So it lost velocity at almost 1 foot per second per degree, and it gained velocity over ambient at a rate of 0.6 feet per second per degree.
That's right. Okay. Yep. So if we go down to the next one, it's a 25-06 with a 117 grain bullet, same temperature windows. From 70 to 0 degrees, it went down 30 feet per second. So a whole lot less than that 300 Win Mag.
Yep.
And from 70 to 125, it went up 35 feet per second. About the same as that 300 Win Mag. Mm-hmm. So it's the same powder. The charge weights are different because you're going to have different charge weights in different cartridges, but the energy potential is the same. The temperature that it was exposed to is the same. But the differences in those cartridge dimensions, not only the chamber, but the cartridge case volumes, how much jump the bullet has to the rifling, the bore and groove dimensions, all of that will have a play in how the powder burns. So it will have an effect.
And so I would say, based on that, that's relatively negligible. I mean, we're talking half of a foot per second per degree.
Yeah.
Over a 70 degree swing, that's huge. And then when you throw in, it didn't change much at all from 70 to 125. That's pretty negligible. It's in getting colder, it was nearly just half as bad as in the 300 Win Mag.
And those numbers, around a half foot per second per degree, that's essentially like the upper threshold that we would say is applicable for long range applications. You want to be maybe at that and less to not have it bite you if you don't account for it.
Okay.
So yeah, you see with the Win Mag, it's going to start to hurt you at longer time of flights. With the 25-06, you probably won't even see it. It's probably within the dispersion, the cone of fire of the system. Mm-hmm. You go to the next one down, you have a 308 with a 178 grain bullet. Pretty much same temperature window. from 70 to 0, it went down 64 feet and 2,800 pounds. And then 70 up to 125, it went up 21 feet and 1,000 pounds. So you kind of see that one act more like the Win Mag did.
Yeah, kind of skewed
at the cold temperatures. And then kind of better than both the Win Mag and the 25-06 at the hotter temperatures. So it's unique again.
Yeah, it's unique on cartridge case volume. Maybe the shape of the powder column has something to do with it. Obviously, you said the bore diameter going to play into that as well as it builds pressure. That is pretty fascinating because, again, when you look at nearly 1 foot per second per degree, that's pretty significant if you're trying to shoot something with a 308 and 178 grain bullet.
Yeah.
You're trying to shoot something a second time of flight and that magical 800 yard line for the 308, that can get pretty iffy if you're not accounting for it.
Yeah. And very commonly, you can experience a 30 to 40 degree shift in temperature from a morning to an afternoon while you're out shooting. So if you didn't account for that, everything might be great in the morning. But if it increases 40 degrees that day by afternoon, your muzzle velocity is increased by, probably 30 to 35 feet per second. Is that going to cause you to miss with a 308 at 1,000? Yeah, unless your target's pretty big.
Yeah. That's always the answer, just get a bigger target.
That's right, yeah. And then the last one we have listed here is a 6.5 Creedmoor with a 140. And on this one, we went a little more extreme on the cold temperature. We went down to negative 20. And the Creedmoor lost 88 feet per second down to negative 20 and 4,000 pounds of pressure. And then up to 125, it gained 70 and went up almost 5,000 pounds.
Wow. So
That's
that was worse.
not so desirable.
No, that's probably, that is the worst performance of your 4 examples.
Yeah.
Same propellant, shorter powder column than any of them, which you would think would help things, but with that smaller bore diameter, maybe whatever it is, that's over 1 foot per second per degree.
Mm-hmm. And the trend that you kind of could make from that is, with the 25-06 being a little bit of an outlier, is as that bore diameter gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the temperature sensitivity seems to get a little bit worse. Maybe you could make that correlation. You'd have to do a lot more testing to determine that. But that is something that we will look at. If there's a powder that we've been using in a 30 caliber application for a while and it's done really well, and we've done a bunch of temp testing on it and it's very stable, and we're all of a sudden going to try it in a 22 caliber configuration, temperature testing is going to be done pretty quickly to see if it doesn't rule itself out.
That's pretty fascinating, and this is just a tiny snippet of the temperature testing that you guys have done over the years.
Yeah.
The amount of data in that folder is remarkable.
Yeah.
And I still have access to that folder since I left Ballistics, so I still play around in there every now and then. But it is remarkable to see how some propellants are better or worse just based on the cartridge. And then when you start throwing in gas gun applications, now it's, not just if you're losing pressure in the chamber, you're losing pressure at the port as well. And that can be a concern. So definitely something that we as manufacturers of ammunition take very seriously.
Yeah.
Because you have to.
And you can have negative aspects on the high side of things. So let's look at this Creedmoor for an example here. At 125, it went up 5,000 pounds of pressure. We have pressure test equipment here. We've talked a lot about that and how we load things to where they're going to operate safely, no matter what your environment is. But we all know, because we have access to the internet, that guys like to hot rod things. So, and Miles, you've taken loads, guys posted off the internet and pressure tested them, and what have you found?
I have had multiple times to stop early so that I don't damage our pressure test equipment.
Yeah. So guys will run high pressures because they're looking for a lot of velocity, and looks like everything's fine, right? The problem can come if you do that load development in, say, 40, 50 degrees, and you have a powder and a cartridge combination that produced temperature sensitivities like this Creedmoor did, where it went up 5,000 pounds. Let's say you're already at 66,000 pounds is the load that you settle on. You can probably shoot that all day long and not have really any problems besides a little bit of reduced brass life, right? You're not going to get as many reloadings out of your case, but you're probably not going to pierce primers. You're probably not going to blow them.
Probably won't even see ejector swipes.
Probably not.
Especially in these custom actions. You'll flip that bolt open with one finger like nothing
So you're at 66,000 pounds and 50 degrees. And then that load shoots so well, you load up a couple hundred rounds of it, and you're getting ready to go out and shoot prairie dogs or a match in the summertime. And the stuff's floating up in the 100 plus degree range, or the temperature your propellant is. You go up 5,000 pounds from 66 and you're at 71. And I've seen this happen at matches.
Oh yeah,
Guys
we've all
blowing
seen
primers, locking up the firing pin in the channel in the bolt face, blowing primers, falling down and locking, especially in gas guns. It's a nightmare. Falls into the barrel extension, locks up the bolt, or it falls down into the fire control group, locks up the trigger mechanism.
Primer in the gas key.
Primer in the gas key. Yeah.
It's quite simply, bolt doesn't want to open.
Yeah.
Anybody got a range mallet?
Right. And without knowing this, you're kind of left to the winds, you know,
Yeah.
like what did this? Like I tested this, I did all my due diligence, you know,
It's all that dust.
early spring. Oh, yeah, all that dust.
That
Probably
dust
the
in New Mexico did it.
Transonic gremlins came into the chamber. Is what
Right.
happened.
Yeah, teleporting.
hmm No, that's a very valid point, though, because in the match setting, we've all seen that. And in hunting, this is extremely common in hunting because hunting takes place largely in the fall, where it's quite possible you're at or below zero. And then it's also quite possible that same day gets above freezing. You and I have hunted in that here Nebraska doesn't get necessarily uber cold or uber hot. We just have a steady mix of cold and hot. And there are days where it's 0 degrees in November. And that same day you'll be wearing a t-shirt at 50 degrees in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Or antelope hunting, right?
Antelope's
You can
a
go
big
from
one,
antelope hunting, you know, at 80 degrees down to whatever, below freezing.
Yeah, pretty
And,
quickly.
you know, the next season, a couple months later.
Yeah. Or you wake up in the morning to go antelope hunting and there's frost on the sage because it's 30 degrees outside, 28 degrees outside, and it will hit 75 degrees that day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to see those type of temperature swings is extremely common. If you're going to try to hit what you're aiming at a non-traditional distance, this really needs to be accounted for because it's not just the muzzle velocity swing, it's the point of impact at longer time of flights that this creates. And I know you've got some examples here of what are the implications of temperature stability and how does that impact us as a shooter?
Right. Well, we can go through that. So this is actually from some load development that I've been doing in the last week or two for
Fresh
a
data.
very specific application. I'll kind of leave that out of it, but there's some long range potential here, right? And so I have 3 different propellants that we've been testing. You know, Miles and Jacob and the whole team has talked a lot about how the combination of bullet, barrel, and powder kind of gives you the lion's share of your performance. And so, you know, testing a couple different powders, we're probably going to see some different results. And so that's a typical tact that we take early on
Absolutely.
in the load development. So I have 3 different powders here. The first powder is a very temperature stable option. It's from 70 to negative 20. It went down 23 feet a second and 700 pounds. From 70 up to 125, it went up 37 feet a second and 79 pounds.
Wow.
That's essentially no change.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
within the test variance.
Absolutely. So very, very small amount. The next powder is the fastest powder of the 3.
Highest velocity.
Yeah, highest velocity.
If you're looking for speed, this is the one.
Yep, and it has the highest energy content. It's got the highest
nitro.
percentage of nitroglycerin in it. So that powder, from 70 down to negative 20, it dropped 100 feet per second and 6,500 pounds of pressure.
Wow.
So something to be, you know, looked at there. If this is a gas gun application, is dropping 6,000 to 7,000 pounds in pressure going to prevent the system from operating? I don't know. Might have to look at that.
Yeah.
And then going from 70 to 125, it went up 74 feet per second and 8,000 pounds of pressure.
And in a gas gun setting, bolt lugs have an opinion.
Sure, sure. And to that example we just talked about with Creedmoor, you know, that one only went up 5,000 pounds there. An 8,000 pound swing, I would say 20 to 40% of the available powders out there could do that in a certain cartridge.
Wow.
So that's not an uncommon number, is what I'm saying.
So in these first 2 examples, the average foot per second per degree of the first powder, the most temperature stable powder, was 0.4 feet per second per degree. This one is 1.2.
Yeah.
basically triple.
That's right.
Okay.
And then the third powder is kind of an in-between option of the two, right?
Okay.
It's got a little bit of nitro, gives you some velocity, but it's a little bit more stable too. And so from 70 to negative 20, that one went down 42 feet a second, 2,700 pounds. Probably not going to have any function-related issues there. From 70 up to 125, it went up 46 feet a second and up 4,000 pounds. Probably not going to have, blown or pierced primers with that. So now those three options all obviously have different temperature sensitivities.
Well, that last one was 0.6 feet per second per degree. So slightly worse than powder number 1, half as bad as powder number 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, here's an interesting point. The average velocities these produced. That first one, the very temperature stable one, 2544 out of this test application.
Okay.
The fastest one, the one that was most sensitive to temperature, 2667. So almost 125 foot per second velocity advantage at ambient temperature. And then the middle ground one is right at 2600. So it's about 50, 60 foot per second faster than the really temp stable first stuff. And it's lagging behind the super fast stuff by about 60 or 70 feet a second.
Okay.
So then if we look at a couple other metrics, the standard deviations on those, these are all 40-shot standard deviations. The super temp stable stuff, that first powder, had an SD of 11.8. That's pretty good on a 40-shot per factory ammo. The next one, the super fast one, the most temperature sensitive one, was 10.2. So SD was a touch better. And then the one that's kind of in the middle, SD of 14.1. So you can kind of start to see here where the considerations are changing, your value of each of them. Yeah. But if we look at what the effects of these three powders would be on target, if you didn't account for the fact that the temperature is going to change the velocity, I have a couple graphs here. So the most temperature stable option, which would be that first one, if you set your gun up, measured your muzzle velocity at 70 degrees, and then never accounted for the temperature effect on velocity after that, you can go all the way down to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're only going to miss by 2 inches at 500.
Wow.
At 1,000 yards, you're going to miss by 10 inches.
1 minute of angle.
Yeah, so that would be the extreme cold, right? Yep. Now let's just inverse that and go to the most temperature sensitive one. Remember, it had the highest velocity. All that's built into this and factored in. So from 70 down to negative 40, if you don't account for it with that very temperature sensitive stuff, you're going to miss by 9 inches at 500.
Almost 2 minutes of angle.
That's pretty significant. Going from missing by 2 inches to 9 inches at 500, that's a lot. At 1,000, you're missing by about 52 inches.
Wow.
That's a lot.
That's almost a human.
Yeah.
My wife is 60 inches tall. You're missing by the height of my wife almost.
And then we look at the other side of it, the high temperature side. So from 70 up to, I have these ran all the way up to 160, but we'll just look at maybe 120 degrees. That's probably realistic for the upper end of most people's application. So the very temp stable stuff at 500, if you don't account for it at 120 degrees, you're missing by a little over 2 inches, maybe 2 to 3 inches, 2.5 inches. The very temperature sensitive stuff, you're missing by 5 to 6 inches. So it was worse when it got cold. When it got hot out, it wasn't quite as bad.
Mm-hmm.
But at 1,000, the very temp stable stuff, you're missing by about 12 inches.
Yeah.
And the very temperature sensitive stuff, you're missing by 30.
The Hornady Auto Charge Pro, providing precise, customizable powder dispensing in an easy-to-use, space-saving unit. The new modernized load cell is precise to within 0.1 grain. The Auto Charge Pro offers customizable trickle speeds for various powder types, as well as custom trickle time settings. With a smaller footprint than competing brands, the Auto Charge Pro still offers a large powder capacity hopper. The Auto Charge Pro from Hornady.
30 inches. So that paints just the easiest picture to see that if you don't account for this, you are going to be chasing your tail. I just saw this at the Hornady PRC in Utah. There's a zeroing board and you can zero your rifle and they have some targets out at range. You see the guys out there plugging away. Bam, bam. bam, spinning their Kestrel around, fudging BCs, fudging velocities, trying to get stuff to line up. Well, I know I'm zeroed at 100 because I just shot it, and then I shot at 500 and I thought it was good, so I went out to 750, and they're just chasing their tail. They've been shooting for an hour. So there's a lot of things going on there that need to be addressed, but one of those things could quite simply be their temperature sensitivity. When they're shooting at 750 yards, they didn't take into account that ammo was tested when it was 50 degrees or 60 degrees or whatever, and the fact that it's 90 degrees there in Utah, that change could be part of the reason they're chasing their tail.
Could be. Yeah. Why don't you talk about your PRS gas gun stuff last year? Because you were frustrated at times, I would say.
That was nuts. Yeah. I mean, this was definitely... So I shot factory ammo for the bulk of the season. I hand-loaded with Varget for the finale, but every match that I shot up to that point, 3 season matches, I shot factory ammo out of the gas gun. And it's pretty much because the powder that's loaded in there gets really good velocity, and it happened to shoot really good out of the rifle. So they're...
Yeah, problem solved.
Don't mess with it,
Yeah.
and takes a lot of work out of my day too. So, but on the backside of that powder has a little bit more temperature sensitivity than what I would typically run for a PRS hand load, bolt action.
And we can divulge for a minute on why we would choose a propellant like that for a cartridge like that. So you mentioned having nitroglycerin adds energy, and it can add energy at the same or lower pressure than a single base propellant can achieve.
Right.
So if we want velocity at low pressure, you use a higher nitroglycerin propellant, you can get that. And so with the 6 arc, which is what you're shooting, you have a max average pressure of 50,000 pounds or 52,000 pounds. That's a low pressure when you compare that to the Creedmoor at 62,000 pounds. So to achieve the velocities and the dispersion, you go with a double base propellant. That's just industry standard.
So the gas gun was running a shorter barrel, so I was already taking a velocity hit shorter than what I would normally run. So I was losing 100 foot per second there. Well, I basically got it back by using the high energy content powder.
Yep.
And then the only downside then to that is that I have to watch temps. And so in FordOff, our solver, there's actually a tab in there for temperature sensitivity.
Yeah, it's in the set load information tab.
And you can turn it on or off, and you have some stuff that's pre-selected that's kind of generic data. It's obviously most accurate to go in and do the test yourself.
Yeah, which we'll talk about here in a moment.
Yeah, we'll hit that. But so I went out to the lab and cheated and used
piezoelectric pressure reading equipment.
Used what I had available to me, and got the temperature sensitivity data off of the ammo that I was shooting, and plug the average basic, because it's almost never linear from ambient to cold or ambient to hot. Those two are at different rates almost all the time.
Right.
But I just averaged it and then plugged that number into FordOff and let it roll. And with rare exception, that worked out really well for me, because basically what it's doing in the background is taking the environmental data that I plug in and update throughout the day, namely temperature, and it's then correcting my muzzle velocity automatically for me based off the sensitivity factor that I plug into it. And really the only times that didn't work out for me was where maybe it's cold out and I have a magazine close to my pocket, or in my pocket close to my body, or something to that effect, like where somehow the ammunition stays insulated from the ambient temperature that I'm plugging in to use for the solver. But yeah, for the most part, I had really great success with that.
Yep. And that was running, somewhere around 1 feet per second per degree, or just slightly under.
It was, and like I said, for 6 arc, that for a ball powder, it's actually really pretty temp stable. Yeah. It's just enough that if I didn't stay on top of it, at the far targets, you'd start seeing it.
Yeah, because when you do some simple math, it's, let's say you tested that at 70 degrees. Well, generally, you're not running a match north of 100 degrees. So if you've got 30 feet per second, that's shifting your whole cone of fire basically a little bit.
20 foot per second.
Yeah, so it's going to be 20 or 30 foot per second at maximum, but it is a shift in the average. So on the exception, you're going to catch those shots that go high.
Right. Well, and if you're Yeah, you're moving a point cloud, right? Yeah, you move that around a little bit. So as accurate as you can make it, the better off you are, basically.
Right. If you didn't control that, though, on the matches where it's 55 or 50 degrees when you start in the morning when you're shooting in April, and then it heats up to 80 degrees, now we're talking a significant lead.
You're standing around after every stage like, why? What's going on? Like, why am I high? Why am I low? Playing that game. Yeah. Yeah.
Which with a gas gun in the PRS world, you're already going to be playing game scratching your head. So don't add another variable to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good explanation of a point I wanted to hit on. Well, how do we decide on what powder we put in a factory load? And it's an all things considered approach. And you were kind of alluding to that of, well, I was running a shorter barrel and it was beneficial to get some of that velocity back. And that benefit was more of a benefit than the trade-off of the temperature sensitivity. And the selection process of what powder you're going to use in a load is really that, because that powder doesn't just affect your muzzle velocity that's produced. It's muzzle velocity and pressure and cleanliness and fouling buildup and how long you can go without cleaning it and how it shoots for dispersion and the velocity it produces. Is that good enough to make your bullet do the job it's supposed to do? Like that powder plays so many, the fingers that come out of powder and touch different aspects of performance are many.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great real world analogy of it.
Yeah. And I would say, I mean, like if a guy really wanted to be picky, even the good stuff, the H4350, Varget, the Hodgin Extreme line, some of the Alliant powders that are really good, you can still see it. And if you're going to be zeroing and setting things up at 70 and then using it at below zero or around there or 50 degrees or more different, you will still see the effects of that. It's not as common because for the most part, you don't want to go shoot a match when it's 0 degrees out.
Right.
People still do it, but
darn right.
But it's just that most of the time those are good enough that the net effect of that creep is not enough to worry about.
Well, let's dive in there a little bit on, okay, you want to be responsible. You get the science of it. You get, okay, we can control it with, choosing single base propellants. We can control it with, or manufacturer controls it with geometry, with deterrence. Okay, I want to be responsible as a precision marksman. I want to take advantage and control all the variables that I can control. If you're using FORDOF, and I'm sure other solvers have it too, a temperature sensitivity factor, how do you test it for yourself? You don't go into the lab with a piezoelectric system and calibrated brass and a transducer and do it that way. You got to do it at home. Is there some simple ways that you guys have found to be an effective way to get a good number on it?
Yeah, the method I've kind of adopted, I can shoot at my house. I have a berm at my house that I can shoot at, which makes it very handy to be able to do this sort of testing. But I've done it at, say a public range or something like that too, where you have to travel a distance to get to where you can actually shoot. I like to do it at one of the two extremes of the seasonal swings, and that's going to be variable depending on where you are in the country. But like the middle of winter, it's already really cold outside. So you can just leave some ammo outside and let it acclimate to that, and you kind of have that end of the spectrum covered.
Right.
I like to do mine in the winter. We're obviously here in Nebraska, so it gets plenty cold outside. I'll leave some ammo outside. I'll leave some ammo in my house where it's ambient 70 degrees. And then I've done it where I just turn my truck on, crank the heater on, and you can get it up to 100-ish degrees even in the wintertime.
Yeah.
I use a Kestrel to record the temperature. And typically, Kestrel has a really cool feature called data log with many of their units where you can set it to take a recording at certain frequencies. And I believe if it's an over 10-second frequency, so 10 seconds or longer, you can actually turn the unit off and it will wake itself up, take a recording, and then turn back off. So it saves your battery.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really handy in these circumstances. But you could do it the opposite too. You could do the test in the middle of the summertime. You could put some ammo in your freezer, in your house, like in your little lunch pail or whatever, right? Something that's insulated. Put the ammo in there, have it open, have the Kestrel laying in there with it. And then when you go to do the test, just close that thing up. And there's going to be a little bit of error there, right?
Sure.
Is the temperature of the propellant going to be exactly, what the Kestrel is saying? Probably not, because there's probably some variability in the thermal transfer rate of the temperature that's in the propellant versus what the Kestrel's measuring right beside the ammo. But it's a lot better than nothing
Not
at
accounting
all.
for it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, ice water, as long as you got solid ice still in it and you throw your ammo in a Ziploc bag. And
Oh, that'll get it
pull as
cold in a darn hurry.
Yeah, but ice water's at 32 degrees until it all melts, and then it'll warm up from there.
Mhm.
But-
Yeah. Do you guys ever use a laser thermometer, little infrared laser thermometer?
I haven't really, just because, I mean, you certainly could if you keep time in mind. So the outside surface of the cartridge's case is going to change temperature probably first and most rapidly compared to the propellant that's down inside of it.
Sure.
So just take that with a grain of salt. Don't take it out of the conditioned environment, let it sit for a few minutes, and then measure the temperature and assume the powder is the same. It's probably not. But
again, it's going to be a lot closer than just not accounting for it.
Yeah, if you don't have a Kestrel, those little thermal like laser thermometers or whatever that you can buy for $15 at a hardware store.
Yep.
That'd be good.
And then too, like we were saying, a lot of days in a lot of places, it's you wake up and it's 45, and then by the end of the day it's 80.
Yeah.
So you can get
You can get some
you
data
can get
there.
a swing just from morning to wait until afternoon. To, same ammo, just let it sit out.
I'm gonna
show up early and then let it sit all day.
Yeah, I am gonna make the sample size jab again here, because I actually if the guy that I'm gonna talk about right now hears this, he'll know what I'm talking about. But he called me up and he said, "Hey, I did some temperature sensitivity testing, and I think he went down to like 18 degrees and up to like 80 or something. It was this spring." And he tested a couple in between, like 40 and 60 and whatever. And he goes, "Man, it doesn't make sense. It moves when it's cold, but it doesn't really move very much at all when it's hot. He was calling to ask me if I had seen that before." And I said, "Well, yes and no." And in his specific application with the likely propellant that was in there, he didn't know what propellant it was, so he was trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I don't think that's right. And I said, how many shots are you shooting at each, bracket or whatever? And it was like 3 or 5 shots. It wasn't very many. When you're trying to establish this, what you're doing is measuring a velocity with cold ammo and measuring velocity at hot ammo. Well, if your sample size is really low, you run the chance that the 3 shots that you do or the 5 shots that you do isn't a good reflection of the actual average there.
Mm-hmm.
And so the risk is that, let's say the 3 shots you shoot of the cold ammo happens to be on the high end of the velocity spectrum that can produce.
Yep.
And then when you do the hot ammo test, you happen to catch the low end in those 3 shots. The amount of change between those two is going to be more than what is the actual difference between those two. So if you're going to do this test, keep sample size in mind. I'm not going to tell you that you have to shoot this many or it's useless. The more you shoot up to 20 or 30, the more confident you can be in your result. If you do 3 at each, it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
If you do 5 at each, it's better than 3 at each. Just keep that in mind as you're doing that test.
He would have probably been better served to save the shots that he shot at 40 and 60 and just put those shots to 18 and 80.
Yeah.
And had a better look, a little finer resolution at those specific temperatures.
Right. Yeah. If you really want to know the answer, unfortunately, sample size applies here too.
Yep. Now with, our friends at Garmin and several others on the market, chronographs, you just mentioned it, the Hornady PRC in Utah. Everybody has one. Everybody has a chronograph. Everybody that was on the zeroing line on Friday or on Thursday before the match, they were getting real-time velocity right there. Every single one of them. So there's never been a time where we as a shooting community have had more velocity data. And
good data too.
Yeah, reliable, consistent, believable data.
Yeah.
Which is pretty remarkable. And if you're doing that and you have, one of those nice pocket radars now, you can keep track of your data and your temperature and build yourself a pretty good idea of the temperature sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And weird things do happen. We've talked a lot about rifle stuff here. In the pistol world, so typically with rifle propellants, going from ambient to hot, you're going to see an increase in velocity and pressure, and ambient to cold, you'll see a decrease in both. The pistol world, not so much. Mm-hmm. A lot of times at cold, you'll see pressure increase quite a bit with pistol powders. And generally, pistol powders are a pretty high nitroglycerin level. But there's another concept or theory that can occur, which is if the powder is of a correct geometry and dimension and it's very, very cold, there's a theory that as the primer goes off, there's enough of a shock effect from that material of the primer going off that you can start to fracture the grains of the propellant.
Mm.
And if you fracture them, you increase the surface area and you expose the inside of the powder. So if you think back to the deterrent concept where it's kind of like an M&M, the hard shell on the outside and the gooey soft chocolate on the inside.
Mm.
Well, if you take an M&M and you crack it open, that thing's going to melt much more quickly than if it stays intact. And so it's hard to say that for sure occurred in a given instance, because you'd probably kind of have to be inside the cartridge case looking at the granules of powder and be like, yep, that one cracked, but certainly the correlations exist there. We've seen that happen.
And the test results don't lie, that it gets cold, pressure goes up.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is pretty wild.
Yeah. And another consideration there, talking pistol stuff and an application for temperature sensitivity is power factor.
Oh, sure.
And this isn't just a long range thing. Like a lot of competitive shooters that are concerned with power factor, which that applies in certain long range stuff like NRL Hunter, but certainly in USPSA and 3-gun and a lot of those other competitions, guys like to run that line, right? Because there's a competitive advantage of having your power factor, right up to the minimum, because then you get to deal with the fastest shot follow-ups and the minimal amount of recoil, but still qualify for that power factor advantage, if it's heavy or whatever it is. But if you don't know this information, you go develop all your loads for this match, you're going to go shoot a 3-gun match or whatever, and then you happen to, when they do the power factor checks, it's 30 degrees cooler out than when you developed all your loads and you were right on the line then, you might fall under your power factor rating, which would be kind of bad.
Yeah, no kidding. There are implications all over the place for temperature sensitivity. Now, completely anecdotal, and you can use some of your test results here. You've done a bunch of testing. In the world of precision rifle, what are a couple of the best powders you've ever tested?
The Hodgdon Extreme series probably is the most legacy and has the longest and biggest reputation.
4350, 4831, Rotumbo, H1000. There's some staples in there.
That series, absolutely. The temperature stable series from Alliant is amazing. Some of the lowest temperature sensitivity factors I've ever seen, like 0, come out of those propellants.
Yeah, Reloader 16, Reloader 23, Reloader 26. I don't know about 15.5. That came out after I left.
Yeah, 15.5 is pretty good.
Yep. But 16, 23, and 26, when those came out, I thought we were doing tests wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like,
this doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's not how it works. Especially with some of those big charge weights. You put Reloader 26 in a 300 PRC, 74 grains of powder in there. You'd think there's going to be a pretty significant shift, but some of that stuff just didn't budge. Yeah, remarkable.
The Hornady Trek Light Lockbox XXL. Constructed of an advanced impact-resistant polycarbonate featuring dual 4-digit TSA locks, the Trek Light Lockbox offers heavy-duty protection at a third of the weight of steel. The included 1,500-pound rated security cable with patented cable connector maximizes cargo space for up to 2 full-sized handguns. The Trek Light Lockbox XXL from Hornady Security.
And then in some of the newer stuff, you had already mentioned Stable HD and Stable Match. Yes, those 3 are very temperature stable.
Yeah, and those, so HD and Match are better than 6.5.
Sure.
But yeah, again, in that family, we've seen some of those that are effectively no change from below 0 to over
40,
to over 100.
To 140.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking single-digit foot per second deltas from top to bottom.
Wow.
Which is pretty.
That is pretty. Doesn't get much better.
Because you're used to seeing this, all the time. Like
30,
how many
40,
thousands of pounds and how many tens of foot per second is it going to be different? And then nothing. Like okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. Yeah. Well, it is an important factor, and as we as a community become more and more refined, I say we, like the precision rifle community specifically, is a demanding community. And over the last 10 years, what they've demanded has been answered, starting with optics, features in the optics, turrets, rangefinders, bullets, ammo, barrels, propellants. Like, they keep demanding better and better things, and they're getting those things. And now we're at a point where, yeah, they've, Alliant came out with those Reloader 16, 23, and 26 line. Phenomenal, and really fits every burn rate that, the serious match shooters are using right now. And then Stay-Ball HD, Stay-Ball Match, 2 iconic burn speeds that they nailed the temperature stability with. And we're just, as a community, continuing to demand more refinement, and the manufacturers are delivering.
Yeah.
There's some other temperature sensitivity implications we should probably cover. So this is all where stuff works, right? Everything's operating. Yeah, we made some considerations like, oh man, this one might cause me to pierce or blow primers or stuff like that, right? But those generally aren't necessarily catastrophic failures. They could be, but they're not every single time. You can have temperature sensitivity performance that is catastrophic.
Okay.
And this typically is seen in the form of a hang fire. Like the click boom type thing. That can be very, very dangerous because a massive pressure spike can occur. We haven't really talked about primers yet, but primers play a role in the temperature sensitivity.
They have, I was going to say, they have sensitivity too.
Yeah. And it's not as significant as the propellant itself. So we've done testing where we've taken charge weights and froze the powder and put the powder in an oven, and then loaded those in an ambient cartridge case, seated the bullet, and tested them right away. And then we've also done the inverse, where we froze or put in the oven the cartridge case and then put ambient powder in them. And what you see is it follows the propellant for the most part. But what you can have happen is combinations of a given propellant and powder and temperature that can cause hang fires or dangerous situations like that to happen. And unfortunately, you see a huge push to like the small primer pocket brass for match shooting in certain cartridges.
Yep.
Like the Creedmoor family, we've seen quite a bit of that available. What a lot of guys don't understand is that you're skirting the line there with the combination of the charge weights that are used within those cartridges, the type of propellant that's used, and then the small rifle primer, that generally at colder temperatures, you can have ignition related issues with those. And so that's something to keep in mind, that a small primer pocket isn't just more material around the primer pocket, meaning you can stand on pressures and your brass lasts longer. There's other things going on as well.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's definitely an implication there. I experienced that when I built my first long range or whatever type hunting rifle. Built that 7 mag that I've talked about here on the podcast, shooting 162 ELDXs with H4831 using a 210 match primer. And there was a while where everything was pretty groovy, and then it was real cold. And I was out here at the GI Rifle Club, and yeah, it would hang fire.
Yeah.
Swapped over to 215, problem solved.
Yeah.
Should have been using the 215 all along, but I was really fighting that gun for accuracy, and that was one of the variables I was playing with.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a good point. Yeah, it's not just it's not just the powder, it's also the primer. And that's something, as ammunition manufacturers, we do a lot of temperature testing that you alluded to, or that you spoke to directly. That includes the primer as well. We will find a propellant that works really well, or obviously you guys have a lot of tribal knowledge of which propellants are going to work, and then you cycle through to test which primers are applicable for this specific SKU.
That can be a big problem.
I was going to say it gets muddy because there's some times where it's like this primer works with all 5 of these cartridges no matter what powder you put in it. And then you put this other powder in with those same 5 cartridges, and for these 3 you better use this primer, and for those 2 you better use this primer, because if you don't do that, problems are coming.
Yeah, it'd be a shame if there was a primer availability issue.
Yeah.
Or powder.
Yeah, because that can really muddy things up in a hurry.
Yeah.
Well, in regard to hand loading, there is some anecdotal / tribal stuff that people just know that, hey, these propellants are temperature stable. But although there are more and more temperature stable propellants being developed, and that market is big, but there are a lot of shooters that want those propellants. So with the right tools, you can use propellants that are maybe more readily available, more available on the shelf when you go to the store. But now you might know okay, this is what I'm dealing with. This is how I can test it, and this is how I can control it for my use case. We talked about doing a lot of your testing where you're minus 20 to 120 degrees, or in the extreme cases, 140 to minus 40. Well, as the end user, you're doing these tests at home. You don't have to test at 0 and 100 degrees. If your hunting season or your match shooting or whatever is going to take place in a 50-degree window, well, you can test at that 50-degree window and get a temperature sensitivity factor. You don't have to test over, 100 degrees or 120 degrees or 140 degrees. If your window is, from 40 to 80 degrees, great. Test it at 40 and 80, and now you know.
And that's liable very, very often to be more accurate for you than getting, because a lot of times they're not linear to begin with. And so if you get, 40 degrees over what you're ever going to use, well, you're getting a ton of really high data over here that's going to skew your average line. Yeah. And you don't want that. So for sure.
I like it. Guys, is there anything else in regard to temperature sensitivity or propellant sensitivity that you want to re-go over? We're knocking on an hour here, so I'd like to wrap it up on temperature sensitivity.
You got anything, Miles?
I don't think so. No, it's not. It's nothing to be scared of.
Yeah.
No.
For sure, there's a lot of options out there. A lot of the old IMR powders you can get superb performance out of them.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you track temps, then you don't have issues. But it's definitely something that if you're totally oblivious to it and it can sneak up on you and cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're aware of it and you account for it correctly, there's really nothing left on the table.
I like it.
Yeah. If you're just a recreational shooter that likes to reload and hand load and go out to the range and plink, you're not one of these competitors or anything like that where you're trying to eke out every level of performance that's there. And you hear this information, you're like, dang, is my stuff close to blowing a primer or any of that kind of stuff? Using reloading handbook data and running, never going over the maxes, all that stuff is going to help you there. Most of the times the amount of pressure increase that's normal with temperature sensitivity isn't going to push you all the way up until you're well past those kind of established limits. That's when you get into troubling territory.
Right.
And then also keep an eye on cold temps. I would recommend guys. I know a lot of guys out there are shooting small primer pocket, high 30, 40 plus grain charge weight cartridges. You might want to check your stuff and see what it does at cold before you just assume it's the same as it was at ambient.
Yeah.
A great point to that is 22 Creedmoor. You've got a 6.5 Creedmoor and you've got the same powder volume, but now a much smaller bore diameter. So you're going to go slower burning in your propellant. I know a lot of guys running hot rod 22 Creeds with Reloader 26 or H1000. So you got this 40-some grain charge of really slow propellant, and they're using small pocket brass. They're trying to light all that propellant up with a small rifle primer. And they everything's groovy in the summertime, and then you go out for a coyote hunt, when it's 0 degrees outside, there could really be some problems.
Yeah.
Sure.
And on that note, kind of tangent, but we've tested it several times, small rifle versus large rifle primer for like SDs, because I know that was one of the selling points of small rifle primer brass was that your standard deviations will be better, and we've never seen anything conclusive.
Yeah, groups are too small.
Yeah, when you really run it out, I've never seen anything conclusive that small rifle or large rifle primer is better. If you go too big of a primer for a case capacity, which almost never happens, like trying to think, like there was some large primer 6.5 Grindle. Like you can get too much primer for the case, but more often than not, you see too little primer for the case being causing issues, especially at cold temperatures.
Got it. Awesome, guys. Well, thanks for diving into temperature sensitivity. Another one of those things that I think our listener, most of them probably somewhat familiar with, but a lot probably not as deep as you guys went here. So again, thanks for carving time out of your day for another Quinlan's Corner.
Sure thing. We got the mugs now. So
yeah, it's official. Cheers.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, guys. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to this episode about temperature sensitivity. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.